The ground once shook with the rage of angry gods. Before science gave us answers, ancient civilizations turned to mythic forces to explain natural disasters, personifying earthquakes and storms as divine beings. This journey uncovers the secret logic behind humanity's oldest stories, revealing why we created gods of chaos and what these tales say about our deepest fears. You will discover how these ancient perspectives on mythic forces shaped entire cultures and still influence how we find meaning in catastrophe today. We will travel from the earth-shattering trident of Poseidon to the cosmic serpents of forgotten empires, exploring why cultures worldwide blamed the same types of monsters for their suffering. What story would you tell to explain a sky filled with fire? Faced with a sky that could crack open without warning, ancient people felt a profound need to make sense of the chaos. They stood before volcanoes and floods with no textbooks, no data, only the raw experience of a world that felt both alive and angry. This is where the first disaster myths were born, not from a place of ignorance, but from a deep psychological impulse to restore order. By giving a name and a face to the earthquake or the hurricane, they transformed a random, terrifying event into a deliberate action. There was now a reason, an intention behind the suffering. A god was angry, a spirit needed appeasement. This was far more manageable than the chilling thought that the universe was simply indifferent. Mythologist Joseph Campbell described these stories as a fundamental bridge, connecting the safe, familiar world of the village to the vast, unknown wilderness beyond. They were not just fanciful tales, they were essential tools for survival. When a community is shattered by a disaster, its very identity is at stake. A shared myth provides immediate comfort, a collective explanation that binds people together. It offers a path forward, a set of rituals to prevent future calamities. The story itself becomes a form of social glue, reinforcing moral codes by framing disaster as a consequence of broken taboos or societal disharmony. Think for a moment about how your own town would react if a massive, unexplained crack suddenly split the earth. Without geologists to provide a scientific cause, the human mind would instinctively seek a narrative. Perhaps the ground was tired of carrying our burdens. Maybe a giant sleeping below had finally stirred. We would craft a story, and that story would give us a shared purpose, a way to process our grief and fear. This universal impulse reveals something crucial about these ancient belief systems. They were sophisticated frameworks for meaning, allowing cultures to look into the abyss and not only endure, but to find a reason to rebuild. This foundational need to mythologize chaos set the stage for the incredible pantheons of gods and monsters we encounter across the ancient world. The rivers did not just provide life, they could take it away without warning. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates, a sudden flood was more than a natural event. It was a verdict. The gods had spoken, and their message was one of pure wrath. This worldview finds its most powerful voice in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the divine council, led by the god Enlil, makes a grave decision. Tired of the clamor of humanity, they vote to unleash a great flood to wipe everyone from the earth. This was not a random act of nature, but a calculated punishment. Enlil, as the god of wind and earth, commanded the very forces that could erase cities from the map. His breath was the storm, his displeasure a tidal wave. In the story, one god disagrees and chooses to warn the virtuous man, Utnapishtim. He whispers the divine secret, instructing him to build a great boat to save his family and the seed of all living things. Here, the myth provides a crucial narrative for survival. It transforms an indiscriminate disaster into a story with a moral compass, where righteousness can earn you a warning and a chance to begin again. The flood was a reset button pressed by the gods, and the myth explained not only why it happened but also how one might be spared. For the people listening to this epic, it reinforced a profound social contract. Community conduct, your actions and your piety, were directly linked to cosmic consequences. A failed harvest or a devastating flood could mean someone, somewhere, had broken a taboo and angered the powers that be. This belief system created a framework for understanding hardship, offering both an explanation for past suffering and a ritualized path to prevent future tragedy. From the unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia, this same human impulse to explain the waters would flow downstream, finding a very different expression along the steady, predictable Nile. The steady, predictable Nile offered a different kind of threat. For the Egyptians, the ultimate danger was not a flood from an angry god, but the unmaking of reality itself. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a cosmic battle was fought in the underworld. The sun god Ra traveled through the darkness on his solar bark, and each night he was attacked by Apophis, a colossal serpent of pure chaos. An eclipse was not a celestial event. It was a moment of supreme peril when Apophis nearly swallowed the sun whole. A sudden sandstorm darkening the sky or a tremor shaking the earth were signs that the serpent was gaining strength, threatening to plunge the ordered world back into the formless void that existed before creation. This was not a myth about punishment, but about maintenance. The Egyptian concept of Maat, a principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice, was the constant goal. The entire society, led by the pharaoh and his priests, participated in a daily ritual struggle to uphold Maat against the relentless push of chaos. Their prayers, their ceremonies, and their spells, many detailed in texts like the Book of the Dead, were not mere superstition. They were essential actions that fortified Ra's bark, helping to ensure the sun would rise again the next morning. This belief system gave every individual a profound, proactive role in the fate of the universe. By living a righteous life and supporting the state's rituals, a person was actively holding back the serpent. A drought was not a random weather pattern. It was a call to arms, a sign that more ritual effort was needed to rebalance the cosmos. The Egyptian worldview transformed the terrifying uncertainty of nature into a manageable, if eternal, conflict. Where Mesopotamian myths saw disasters as divine verdicts, the Egyptians saw them as battles in a war they were equipped to fight. This focus on maintaining a delicate cosmic balance stands in stark contrast to the more volatile and emotionally driven pantheon that would emerge from the mountains and seas of ancient Greece. The temperament of the Greek gods was as unpredictable as the sea itself. When the earth trembled, it was not a blind geological force, but the deliberate fury of Poseidon, the earth shaker. His iconic trident was not merely a symbol of his rule over the oceans. It was a divine tool he could strike against the land itself, cracking the very foundations of the world. This belief transformed every tremor from a random event into a message. A city that experienced an earthquake had to ask itself, what did we do to anger the god? The story of Hylike offers a haunting answer. This powerful city-state was said to have been completely swallowed by the sea in a single night, its ruins lost for centuries. Ancient writers claimed this catastrophe was Poseidon's retribution because the people of Hylike had refused to surrender a statue of the god to a group of neighboring worshippers, or in some versions had killed his priests. Their refusal to honor him was met with utter annihilation. This myth provided a terrifyingly clear cause and effect, a narrative that made sense of the senseless. It was not just a story, it was a lesson. Homeric hymns explicitly praise Poseidon as the one who shakes the earth, directly linking his divine persona to the most terrifying geological events. This belief had profound, practical consequences for daily life. Greek city-states, living in constant awareness of this divine threat, built magnificent temples in his honor, often on coastal promontories or in areas known for seismic activity. These were not just places of worship, they were instruments of civic safety. Through lavish sacrifices, prayers, and festivals, a community believed it could appease the gods' volatile temper and potentially buy its own security. Think about how this shaped their entire worldview. An unstable coastline or a rumbling mountain was not a natural hazard zone. It was the personal domain of a powerful, emotional being. This personification of nature as a moody family of gods offered a framework for negotiation with the uncontrollable. The logic of blaming a temperamental deity for a natural disaster found a powerful new expression just to the west, where the Romans looked upon their own smoldering mountains and saw not a god's weapon, but the very forge of creation itself. For the Romans, a volcanic eruption was the world's greatest blacksmith at work. The terrifying plumes of smoke and rivers of fire pouring from Mount Vesuvius were not merely destruction. They were the visible signs of Vulcan laboring at his anvil deep within the earth. This god of fire and the forge presided over a subterranean workshop, often said to be beneath volcanic mountains like Etna or Vesuvius, where his Cyclops assistants hammered out thunderbolts for Jupiter and weapons for the other gods. The ash that choked the air and the lava that consumed entire cities were seen as the unavoidable byproducts, the divine soot and slag, of this celestial craftsmanship. Roman poets like Ovid wove narratives where an eruption was either a sign of Vulcan's intense, focused labor or a burst of his divine anger. This interpretation created a powerful duality. The very same volcanic force that could erase a landscape in moments was also the source of immense future fertility, as the mineral-rich ash renewed the soil for generations of bountiful harvests. The myth of Vulcan provided a complete story that acknowledged both the immediate horror and the potential for rebirth. It allowed a Roman farmer watching the sky darken to process his terror not just as a victim of random violence, but as a witness to a cosmic process. The destruction had a purpose, however brutal, woven into the cycle of creation and sustenance. This belief system offered a form of resilience, a way to endure the unthinkable by focusing on the promise of eventual renewal that would literally spring from the ashes. How does a society cope with a force that can both give and take life with the same breath? It creates a god who is a craftsman, not just a destroyer, framing catastrophe within a longer, more hopeful story of regeneration. From the fires of Rome, our journey takes us to a world where disaster was not a god's labor, but the final, inevitable battle at the end of all things. In the frozen silence of the Norse world, winter was not a season but a constant threat. The myths born from this landscape did not speak of gods who could be easily appeased, but of an inevitable, glorious end. This was Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a prophesied cataclysm where the entire cosmos would be torn apart. The bonds holding the trickster god Loki were destined to snap, and the earth itself would quake with his struggles, signaling the beginning of the end. This was not a punishment for human failing, but a cosmic event written into the very fabric of destiny. An avalanche burying a village or a sudden, violent storm at sea were not random tragedies. They were rehearsals for the final performance, echoes of the greater chaos to come when the monstrous wolf Fenrir would break his chains and the world would sink beneath the waves. The poetic Edda describes the sky growing dark and stars falling from the heavens, a vivid portrayal that mirrors the atmospheric effects of a volcanic winter or a punishing blizzard. For the Norse, these environmental crises were chapters in a much larger, unavoidable story. This narrative provided a powerful framework for resilience. Hardship was not a sign that you had angered the gods, but that you were living in a time foretold, a necessary step in a divine cycle. How does a culture endure in a world so harsh? It does so by believing that the struggle itself has meaning, that the freezing cold and the trembling ground are part of a destined order leading to renewal. The most profound element of Ragnarok is not the destruction, but what follows. The myths tell of a new, green world rising from the waters, a fresh start where a few gods survive and humanity begins again. This cyclical view of catastrophe stands in stark contrast to the linear punishment myths of other cultures, where the Mesopotamians saw a flood as a one-time divine reset, and the Greeks saw an earthquake as a specific act of wrath. The Norse saw every disaster as part of an eternal, repeating pattern of death and rebirth. This belief system did not encourage passive acceptance, but a courageous embrace of fate. It forged a worldview where honor was found in facing an inevitable end with bravery, a perspective that turned survival in a brutal climate into a form of cosmic heroism. From this northern vision of the world consumed by the sea, we can look to the myths of island cultures who lived every day surrounded by that same oceanic power. Across the vast emptiness of the Pacific, the ocean was not a barrier but a living, breathing god. For Polynesian navigators, every voyage was a conversation with Kanaloa, the great deity of the deep. A sudden typhoon that could shatter their voyaging canoes or a tsunami that erased islands from the horizon was not a random storm. It was the active displeasure of this powerful being, a test of human resolve from the Lord of the Underworld. Oral chants and traditions spoke of Kanaloa commanding not just the waves, but the sea monsters that lurked in the abyss, framing the ocean as a sentient, willful force. This belief was woven directly into the fabric of survival. Before setting sail, navigators would make careful offerings and perform specific rituals, not as empty superstition, but as essential protocol to appease the god's temperament. The way a sailor read the swells, the patterns of bird flight, and the subtle shifts in the wind were all acts of respectful observation, a way of listening to Kanaloa's mood. These mythic stories were a brilliant cultural technology, encoding generations of hard-won empirical knowledge within a spiritual framework. A chant about Kanaloa's anger might describe the precise color of the sky before a hurricane, while a story of his favor could detail the calm wave patterns that signaled a safe passage ahead. The personification of the ocean reinforced a profound collective responsibility. The safety of the entire crew depended on every individual's respect for the natural world, a value that bound the community together. Think about the immense courage it took to venture into that endless blue, with only the stars and stories as your guide. These myths provided both a spiritual compass and a practical survival manual, allowing explorers to navigate a world of immense power by believing it was a world they could respectfully engage. This deep integration of belief and knowledge, where every wave held a divine message, stands in stark contrast to the mountain-bound civilizations who saw the earth itself as a sacred, demanding being. High in the Andes, every mountain peak was a living god. These were the Apu, powerful spirits who watched over the valleys and the people below. An earthquake was not a shifting tectonic plate. It was the Apu shaking its shoulders in anger. A landslide that buried a village was not a random event. It was a deliberate punishment from a neglected mountain deity. For the Inca, the entire landscape was a sacred, breathing entity, and their survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance with it. Central to this worldview was Pachamama, the Earth Mother, who provided fertility and sustenance, but who demanded constant respect. The Apu, the spirits of the individual mountains, were her powerful children, the protectors of specific communities. This belief created a profound contract between the people and the land. In return for protection and water from the mountain glaciers, the people offered constant tribute. These were not grand, bloody sacrifices, but daily acts of reverence. A farmer would bury a few coca leaves in the soil before planting. A traveler would pour a small amount of chicha, a corn beer, onto the ground as an offering before a journey. These rituals were essential maintenance for the cosmic order. Inca records and oral histories make it clear that a failure to provide these offerings, or the breaking of a social taboo, could lead to immediate and devastating consequences. The earth itself would become the instrument of divine justice. This belief system did more than explain disasters. It actively shaped one of history's most remarkable empires. Consider the incredible terracing that carved the steep mountainsides into fertile farms. This was not just brilliant engineering, it was an act of reverence. By carefully sculpting the slopes without causing erosion or landslides, the Inca were showing respect to the Apu, ensuring the mountain's stability and continued favor. Their entire agricultural and architectural practice was a form of dialogue with the divine. A collapsed terrace after a heavy rain was not just an engineering failure, it was a spiritual one, a sign that the local Apu had been displeased by some community misstep. This intertwining of ecology and deity created a powerful mechanism for social and environmental management. It enforced sustainable practices and provided a spiritual framework for conflict resolution, as community leaders could point to a recent hardship as evidence that the Apu required appeasement. The Inca lived in a world where the line between the physical and the spiritual was invisible, where the stability of the very ground beneath their feet was a direct reflection of their moral and ritual conduct. This deep connection to earthly spirits stands in stark contrast to the forces feared in East Asia, where chaos was often depicted as a serpentine dragon soaring through the heavens. A dragon sleeping beneath the river could shake the entire empire. In ancient China, a sudden earthquake was rarely seen as a simple tremor, but as the stirring of a celestial dragon deep within the earth or a river. Texts from the Zhou dynasty describe the Yinglong, a winged dragon, as a powerful rain deity whose movements could bring either life-giving floods or catastrophic deluges. This was not a random act of nature, but a direct reflection of the cosmic balance. The emperor, as the son of heaven, held a sacred responsibility to maintain harmony between the earthly realm and the celestial forces. His personal virtue, his de, was believed to influence the natural world itself. A just and moral ruler would preside over calm seasons and bountiful harvests, a sign that the mandate of heaven was secure. But a corrupt or incompetent emperor would disrupt the cosmic equilibrium, causing the yin and yang to fall out of balance. The result was a world out of joint, signaled by droughts, floods, and earth-shaking dragons. This belief system transformed every natural disaster into a potent political message. A devastating earthquake was not just a tragedy, it was a celestial verdict, a public sign that the ruling dynasty had lost its heavenly right to rule. Historical records are filled with accounts of emperors performing elaborate rituals to calm the dragon spirits and restore order after such an event. They would offer sacrifices, issue formal apologies to heaven, and examine their own governance for failures. The mythology served a crucial political function, legitimizing new rulers who could claim to have restored the cosmic balance while providing a clear, moral justification for overthrowing a corrupt regime. Think of the immense power this idea held. It embedded the raw, unpredictable force of nature directly into the heart of state ideology, making human ethics and planetary stability part of the same conversation. For the common person, a flood that destroyed their home was not a meaningless hardship, but part of a larger, moral universe where the actions of their leaders had tangible, cosmic consequences. This framework allowed entire communities to contextualize their suffering, seeing it as a painful but necessary step in the correction of a deeper imbalance, a belief that shaped the rise and fall of dynasties for centuries. This ancient vision of serpentine forces shaping human destiny finds a powerful echo in the vibrant traditions of India. A world balanced on the hoods of a thousand-headed serpent is never truly still. In the vast cosmology of Hindu tradition, the entire Earth is supported by the great cosmic serpent Shesha, whose name itself means what remains, the eternal residue from one cycle of creation to the next. When the ground shakes and tremors ripple across the land, it is not a sign of divine punishment, but simply Shesha adjusting his massive coils. This is a universe in perpetual motion, where stability is an illusion maintained by a benevolent, living being. An even more profound explanation for natural chaos lies in the story of the Samudra Manthan, the churning of the cosmic ocean. In this epic narrative, detailed in texts like the Puranas, the gods and demons temporarily set aside their eternal conflict to work together. They used the serpent king Vasuki as a rope and the mountain Mandara as a churning rod, twisting him back and forth to stir the depths of the primordial sea. This divine collaboration was not a gentle process. It released a maelstrom of cosmic forces, churning up violent waves and shaking the very foundations of the world. From this turbulence emerged both terrible poison, which threatened to end all life, and the nectar of immortality, which promised eternal bliss. This myth presents disaster not as a verdict, but as an unavoidable side effect of a grand creative endeavor. The struggle between order and chaos is not a war to be won, but a necessary tension that generates existence itself. The poison and the nectar arise from the same source, teaching that destruction and creation are two sides of a single cyclical process. For communities facing a tsunami or an earthquake, this philosophy provided a profound framework for resilience. A catastrophe was not a permanent end, but a transient, if painful, phase in an endless cycle of dissolution and renewal. This perspective fosters a remarkable long-term view of recovery. The focus shifts from asking why this happened to us to understanding how to endure this moment as part of a much larger story. It encourages acceptance not as passive surrender, but as a wise acknowledgement of the universe's fundamental nature. How does a society rebuild after everything is lost? It does so by believing that from the deepest churning of the ocean, even amid the poison, the potential for new life and immortality will eventually surface. This vision of a cosmos perpetually balanced between creation and destruction finds a unique echo in the island nation of Japan, where the earth itself is born from divine interaction. The dragon's palace lay just beyond the breakers, a shimmering realm of coral and pearl where time itself flowed differently. For the people of Japan, the sudden, monstrous waves that could erase a fishing village from the shore were the direct wrath of Yujin, the dragon god of the sea. He ruled from his subaquatic palace, Yugu-jo, and commanded the tides with a pair of magical tide jewels. One jewel summoned the waters to rise, the other forced them to recede. A tsunami was not a wave, it was Yujin's deliberate decision, a surge of divine anger made manifest. The beloved folktale of Yorishima Taro captures this perfectly. A fisherman rescues a turtle and is rewarded with a journey to the Dragon Palace, where he is entertained by Ryujin's daughter. He spends what feels like a few days in bliss, only to return to his village and find that centuries have passed on land. This heartbreaking time distortion is a powerful metaphor for the tsunami's impact. One moment, life is normal. The next, everything you knew is gone, lost to a force that operates on a timescale beyond human understanding. The story is a beautiful, tragic warning about the sea's unpredictable nature. These narratives were more than just explanations. They were essential tools for building cultural resilience. Coastal communities held vibrant festivals to honor Ryujin, with prayers, music, and offerings cast into the waves. These rituals were a form of civic diplomacy with a volatile neighbor, a continuous effort to maintain a respectful relationship and plead for calm waters. The myths encoded crucial ecological wisdom. Stories warned against overfishing, polluting the waters, or showing disrespect to marine life, as any offense could bring the dragon's fury crashing down. This created a powerful incentive for sustainable practices long before the term existed. A community's survival depended on reading the ocean's subtle signs, the behavior of fish, the color of the water, the feel of the wind, and interpreting them as messages from region. This deep-seated cultural memory, woven from myth and ritual, fostered a state of constant, respectful preparedness. It taught generations that the sea was not a resource to be conquered, but a powerful, conscious entity to be honored. This reverence for an intelligent, temperamental force of nature finds a parallel in the myths of the Americas, where the wind itself was a god who demanded a different kind of respect. A whirlwind was not an empty column of air, but a living being. For the Lakota and other plains peoples, the sky was the domain of the Wakinian, the Thunderbirds, immense winged spirits whose flashing eyes were lightning, and whose great wing beats were the roar of the tornado. These were not mindless forces of destruction, but powerful, sacred beings who brought both purifying rain and terrifying winds. Other tribes, from the Gulf Coast to the eastern woodlands, spoke of mighty wind spirits whose displeasure could gather the clouds into a hurricane. A violent storm was never random. It was a form of communication, a clear signal that the spirits required attention. This belief transformed a terrifying event into a conversation. The community's response was immediate and collective. Specific songs were sung, intricate dances were performed, and sacred offerings like tobacco were given, all with the intent of calming the fury of the sky. These rituals were acts of respectful negotiation, a way for people to realign themselves with the powerful forces they believed governed the world. This world, you fostered a profound and practical ecological ethic. If the wind spirits could be angered by human disrespect, then every action toward the land mattered. Overhunting, wasteful harvesting, or polluting a water source was not just bad practice. It was a spiritual offense that could bring the storm clouds down upon everyone. This mythology directly linked personal and community behavior to environmental stability, making sustainable living a matter of immediate survival. Think of the deep humility this required. You would not take more than you needed from the forest, not merely for practical reasons, but because the forest itself was alive with sentient, responsive powers. The personification of the wind created a relational framework for existence, one built on reciprocity rather than domination. It was a system that taught generations to live with the land, not just on it, promoting a balance that sustained communities for centuries. This ancient, spirit-filled dialogue with the environment finds a powerful parallel in the stark, sun-baked landscapes of Australia. The land itself remembers the stories of its own creation. In the vast, sun-scorched expanse of Australia, the Dreamtime is not a distant past but a continuous reality, a layer of existence where ancestral beings shaped the world and left their indelible marks. These creator spirits, like the immense rainbow serpent, did not simply make the land and depart. They traveled, they fought, they loved, and their epic journeys carved the rivers, piled up the mountains, and left behind every waterhole. A sudden, catastrophic flood was not a random weather event, but the reenactment of the rainbow serpent's powerful passage, bursting from the earth to form a new watercourse. An earthquake might be the stirring of a great ancestral being shifting in its sleep deep beneath the surface. These narratives are not mere explanations. They are the legal and spiritual title deeds to the land itself, passed down through countless generations in the intricate pathways of songlines. A songline is a living map, a sequence of lyrics and melodies that describe the precise route an ancestor took, naming every rock, tree, and watering hole along the way. To sing the song is to navigate the continent, but it is also to perform the act of creation again, maintaining the world's vitality through ritual. This world frames disaster in a unique way. A flood is not a punishment from an angry god, but the landscape itself remembering and reliving its own powerful story. Human actions are crucial within this cycle. If a community fails to perform the correct ceremonies at a sacred site, or if they disrespect the land by breaking a taboo, they risk awakening the ancestral force in a disruptive way. The consequence is not a divine sentence, but a natural rebalancing as the living landscape responds to the imbalance. This fosters a profound custodial relationship with the environment. You do not own the land, you belong to it, and your sacred duty is to care for it, to sing its stories, and to ensure the ancestors can rest peacefully. Every hill has a consciousness, every river has a history, and every person is a temporary guardian in an eternal story. How would you treat the world if you believed every feature of it was alive with sacred meaning? This deep, timeless connection to place, where myth and geography are one, stands in stark contrast to the mythologies of rising and falling cities, where the stones themselves tell stories of a more transient human glory. The sun required human strength to rise each morning. For the Aztecs, a drought was not merely a lack of rain, it was a sign that the sun god Tanatia was growing weak, that the fifth and final world was teetering on the edge of a cosmic collapse. Their creation myths, preserved in texts like the Florentine Codex, told of 4 previous suns, 4 worlds that had already been annihilated by jaguars, hurricanes, volcanic fire, and a great flood. A modern earthquake was not a new phenomenon. It was a terrifying echo of those past cataclysms, a potential preview of their own world's end. This belief system transformed every natural anomaly into an urgent omen. Priests meticulously observed the heavens and earth, interpreting a tremor as a message from Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. A shaking ground could signal his displeasure, a warning that life-giving waters would be withheld unless proper respect was shown. The stakes could not have been higher, for the survival of the entire cosmos depended on a constant, sacred transaction. The sun needed nourishment, a divine energy known as Chalchiuhatl, or precious water, which was found only in human life. This profound cosmic urgency fueled the practice of ritual offerings, a solemn duty to feed Tanatia and strengthen him for his daily battle across the sky. This was not an act of cruelty, but one of profound responsibility, a collective effort to maintain the cosmic order. This world, you created a society permanently attuned to the signs of the gods, where political authority and spiritual duty were tightly interwoven. The state's immense power was channeled into vast ceremonial calendars and large-scale observances, all designed to secure the sun's continued journey. The empire's expansion can be seen, in part, as a desperate effort to acquire the necessary spiritual resources to sustain the universe itself. Consider the immense psychological weight of believing that your community's rituals were the only thing preventing the stars from going out forever. This profound focus on nourishing a celestial power finds a powerful parallel in West Africa, where the survival of entire communities depended not on the sun, but on earning the favor of the rainmaker. The sky itself could become a court of justice. In Yoruba tradition, a crack of thunder was not just a sound, it was the voice of Shango, the king and god of thunder and lightning. When storm clouds gathered and lightning split the heavens, it was believed Shango was casting down fiery stones of judgment upon wrongdoers. His power was immense and direct, a celestial force that could strike a dishonest leader or a treacherous neighbor with divine fire. Yet this was not mere random destruction. Earthquakes, sometimes attributed to other orishas like the earth deity, were part of this complex system, a reminder that the very ground could be disturbed by spiritual forces. Shango's own story, preserved in vibrant oral histories, reflects this dual nature. He was a legendary king of the Oyo Empire who, after a period of hardship, ascended to the sky and became an Orisha. His myth explains the storm's fury not as mindless chaos, but as the manifestation of a royal authority overseeing human conduct from above. the lightning bolt was his scepter and the thunder was his royal decree. This belief provided a powerful moral framework for the community. The fear of a sudden storm was transformed into a respect for cosmic justice. It encouraged people to resolve conflicts fairly, to tell the truth, and to live in harmony, lest they attract the attention of the Sky King. This personification of the storm as a justice system deeply influenced social norms. A dispute between families might be settled more earnestly with the shared understanding that an unresolved injustice could literally call down fire from the heavens. The rituals dedicated to Shango turned this fear into a vibrant celebration of divine authority. Through energetic dancing, the hypnotic rhythms of the bata drum, and offerings, worshippers did not just plead for mercy. They celebrated Shango's strength and sought to align themselves with his power, asking for protection and moral clarity. These ceremonies were a communal reinforcement of the values he represented. The stories of Shango provided a clear answer to the question of why bad things happen to seemingly good people. A lightning strike that destroyed a home was a tragic event, but within the mythic framework, it could be interpreted as a targeted act of justice, a severe reminder of the importance of righteousness that ultimately upheld the community's spiritual health. This concept of thunderous, immediate divine justice stands in quiet contrast to the earthbound magic of Celtic lore, where power simmered not in the clouds, but within the silent, deep-rooted forests and misty springs. A sudden landslide could be the otherworld shrugging its shoulders. For the Celtic peoples of ancient Ireland and Gaul, the ground beneath their feet was not an inert mass of rock and soil, but a thin veil separating our reality from a parallel one, a realm of potent spirits and eternal feasts known as the Otherworld. This hidden dimension was not a distant afterlife, but a coexisting layer of reality, its inhabitants deeply aware of and responsive to human actions. An earthquake tremor was rarely seen as a simple geological event. It was far more likely a ripple effect from a battle being fought between otherworldly armies, or the heavy footfall of a giant like Balor stirring in his subterranean prison. More commonly, it was a deliberate sign of displeasure from the local spirits, the deities of the land like the horned Tsunamis, lord of animals and the underworld, if a sacred rule was broken. The landscape itself was dotted with portals to this hidden realm. A particular grassy hill or shea might open on a certain night to reveal the dazzling halls of the Tuatha De Danann. A specific cave mouth might lead not into darkness but into the eternal twilight of the otherworld. These were not just picturesque locations, they were diplomatic checkpoints between worlds. To disturb such a place, to cut down a sacred grove or pollute a holy spring, was not vandalism. It was a profound act of disrespect that demanded a response. The ground might shake, a section of hillside could slump away, or a spring might run dry, all because the local spirits had been offended. This belief system transformed the entire act of living into a continuous practice of supernatural diplomacy. Every community learned which trees were sacred, which wells held healing power, and which stones were not to be moved. Farmers would leave small offerings of milk or grain at the edge of a known fairy fort. Travelers would whisper a word of respect when passing a certain ancient oak. These were not superstitions, they were essential protocols for maintaining harmony with the powerful, unseen neighbors who could directly influence their physical safety. This animistic view created a profound culture of place-based reverence. You did not simply live on the land, you lived in a relationship with it, a relationship that required constant attention and respect. The well-being of your family and your village was directly tied to the well-being of the local spirits. This fostered a communal form of disaster prevention, where everyone shared the responsibility of reading the land's subtle signs and performing the small, daily rituals of appeasement. How would you build your home if you believed the hill behind it was alive and watching? This deep, interwoven connection between the visible and invisible worlds where every action had a potential geological consequence, stands in quiet contrast to the celestial courts of Slavic tradition, where the order of the world was maintained by gods who ruled from the sky itself. A thunderclap was the sound of divine warfare. For ancient Slavic tribes, the sky was not a passive expanse but a cosmic battlefield where Perun, the formidable god of thunder and lightning, waged an eternal war against Veles, the serpentine god of the underworld and chaos. A flash of lightning was Perun hurling his mighty axe, a sacred weapon that purified the land by striking down the forces of evil. The resulting thunder was the deafening crash of his celestial combat. But this struggle was not confined to the heavens. When Veles attempted to rise from his watery domain, stealing the cattle of the gods or threatening the cosmic order, the earth itself would rebel. A devastating flood was not merely a river overflowing its banks. It was seen as Veles escaping his confines, his chaotic influence spilling into the human world. A wildfire sparked by a lightning strike was a paradoxical event, a necessary cleansing by Perun that also brought destruction, a purge of the chaos Veles had sown. This powerful dualism provided a complete and compelling framework for understanding environmental turmoil. A natural disaster was never a random accident. It was a visible symptom of the unseen war between cosmic order and primordial chaos. This belief system demanded human participation. To ensure their safety, communities had to actively choose a side. They aligned themselves with Perun through solemn oaths sworn in his name and by carving his symbols like the six-petaled thunder mark or a simple axe shape into the wooden beams of their homes. These totems were not mere decorations, they were a form of spiritual fortification, a declaration of allegiance meant to ward off the creeping influence of Veles. Think of the profound unity this created within a tribe, facing a common, perceived threat from the chaotic forces embodied by Veles. Social values like bravery, loyalty, and keeping one's word were not just abstract virtues. They were essential survival strategies, the very qualities that would please the thunder god and earn his protection. A broken oath was not just a personal failing, it was an act that could weaken Perun's favor and invite chaos into the entire community. The myth transformed the terrifying uncertainty of a storm into a narrative of cosmic justice and communal responsibility. It taught that safety was earned through collective righteousness and unwavering support for the forces of order. The echoes of such thunderous clashes between sky gods and earth serpents can be found in the fiery creation stories told by the peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The thunder was the beating of its wings. Along the misty coasts of the Pacific Northwest, the sky was not empty but inhabited by the Thunderbird, a being of such immense size that the flapping of its wings created the rumble of storms. When it dove from the heavens to grapple with a whale in the ocean depths, the entire world shook. The resulting tidal waves that crashed upon the shore were not random acts of nature, but the violent wake of this primordial struggle. For the Quileute and other coastal nations, this was the fundamental explanation for tsunamis and earthquakes. The Thunderbird was not a mindless destroyer, however. It was a powerful protector, and its eternal conflict with the whale-like creatures of the deep was a necessary battle to maintain a kind of balance. The very danger that defined their coastline was also the source of its profound beauty and abundance. This narrative beautifully encapsulated the dual nature of their world, where disaster was an inevitable, rhythmic outcome of a conflict that had been raging since the beginning of time. These oral histories were far more than just spiritual accounts. They were sophisticated vessels for survival knowledge, meticulously encoded within the drama of the myth. A story about the Thunderbird preparing for a fight might describe how the salmon suddenly vanished from the rivers or how the seals behaved unusually on the rocks. These were not incidental details. They were critical, memorizable signs that signaled the need for the entire village to gather their belongings, and moved to higher ground immediately. The spiritual story became an unforgettable mnemonic device, ensuring that the community remembered the practical evacuation protocols that had kept them safe for generations. This seamless blending of the sacred and the practical fostered a unique relationship with the environment. Humans were not seen as masters who could conquer the ocean or calm the quaking earth. They were participants in a much larger, ongoing drama, playing the role of respectful observers who had learned to read the cues of the powerful beings around them. This perspective did not encourage fear, but a profound and watchful respect. It was a worldview built on adaptation. You did not build a permanent settlement on the most exposed part of the shore because you understood that the Thunderbirds' battles would periodically reclaim that space. You learned the patterns of the giants, and you structured your life accordingly. How different is this from trying to dominate a force of nature with a seawall, only to see it eventually overmatched? The myth taught resilience through humility and survival through keen observation and timely retreat. These epic clashes between sky and sea, forever preserved in story and art, find a powerful parallel in the most universal of all disaster myths, the Great Flood that appears in traditions across the globe. A great flood appears in the mythology of nearly every ancient culture, from the highlands of Greece to the islands of Polynesia. This is not a coincidence. The Mesopotamian story of a wrathful council of gods finds a parallel in the Hindu account of Manu, a righteous man warned by a fish to build a ship and preserve life. In the Americas, indigenous traditions tell of entire worlds being washed away. Water in these stories is rarely just a destructive force. It is a divine broom, sweeping clean a world grown corrupt or overcrowded, making space for a new beginning. The scholar Mircea Eliade saw these myths as powerful reset buttons for the human spirit. They depict disaster not as a meaningless end, but as a necessary purification, a way for the cosmos to cleanse itself of moral decay and offer a chance for redemption. This idea embeds a profoundly cyclical view of history, where civilizations are not on a linear path, but move through ages of growth, corruption, and renewal. The common structure of these stories is what makes them so revealing. There is almost always a warning, whether from a sympathetic deity or a talking animal. This warning is a narrative seed of hope, suggesting that foresight and virtue can earn a reprieve from total annihilation. Then there is the survivor, the one righteous individual or family chosen to carry the flame of life forward. Finally, there is the covenant, the promise or lesson learned. In the biblical narrative, it is the rainbow, a sign of a new agreement between the divine and humanity. For other cultures, the lesson is an unspoken understanding about living in greater harmony with the world. This three-part structure shows how ancient societies processed immense collective trauma. They transformed their most terrifying memories of real floods into structured narratives that taught resilience and ethical living. By telling the story of a single family saved, they gave everyone a model for survival. By ending with a promise, they transformed paralyzing fear into a guide for future generations. What does this global chorus of flood stories tell us? It speaks to a shared vulnerability. Before modern engineering, every human community living near a coast or a major river knew the existential threat of rising water. These myths are a collective acknowledgement of nature's ultimate power, a power that transcended any one culture's borders. But more than that, they reveal a deep psychological need to find meaning in catastrophe. It is far more bearable to believe a flood was a purposeful cleansing than to accept it as a random act of an indifferent universe. These stories are testaments to our enduring hope, our stubborn belief that even from the deepest waters, a new world can always emerge. This universal impulse to craft meaning from chaos leads us to the very core of why we tell these stories at all. Our minds are wired to find a face in the storm. Cognitive science reveals that this ancient impulse to create disaster deities stems from a fundamental feature of human psychology known as agency detection. In a world filled with unpredictable sounds and movements, our ancestors who assumed a rustle in the grass was a predator rather than the wind were more likely to survive. This same hypervigilance, this tendency to see intention behind random events, was projected onto the grandest scales. An earthquake felt less like a shifting rock and more like a deliberate stomp. A hurricane was not a complex weather system, but the breath of a furious giant. Scholars like Pascal Boyer point out that by personifying a flood or a drought, we transform it from an incomprehensible force into a being with motives. A being can be understood, a being can be appeased. This cognitive shift is profoundly calming. It replaces the terror of meaningless chaos with the manageable problem of a displeased entity, turning overwhelming fear into a puzzle with a potential solution. This need for narrative coherence is especially powerful in the aftermath of trauma. When a community is shattered by disaster, the human mind struggles to accept that such devastation could be random. There must be a reason. A story emerges to stitch the broken pieces of reality back together, providing a framework for collective grief and a path toward healing. This psychological drive did not just create stories, it forged entire systems of action. The rituals that grew from these myths were a form of practical psychology. The sacrifice thrown into the churning sea for Poseidon was not an empty gesture. It was a tangible act that gave people a sense of influence over their fate. The prayers chanted to a mountain spirit were a way to channel helplessness into focused appeal. These practices transformed passive fear into an active, communal process, restoring a crucial sense of agency when the world felt most out of control. Furthermore, these mythic stories became the hard drives of the ancient world, preserving vital survival information across generations. A dramatic tale about a river god's anger would encode the memory of a 100-year floodline more effectively than a simple warning. The legend of the Thunderbirds' fight with the whale perfectly packaged the signs of an approaching tsunami into an unforgettable narrative. The story itself became the vessel for the data, ensuring that the knowledge necessary for survival was passed down not as a dry instruction, but as a compelling epic that everyone would remember. This innate storytelling impulse is not a relic of the past. When a modern economic collapse or a global health challenge occurs, we still instinctively search for a narrative, for a responsible party or a clear chain of events. We crave a story that makes the chaos coherent. Recognizing this deep-seated psychological need allows us to see these ancient myths not as primitive fictions, but as brilliant, adaptive tools. They were the mind's way of building a raft of meaning to navigate the terrifying and unpredictable waters of existence. These stories of angry gods and restless spirits became the blueprints for entire civilizations. The Inca did not simply carve terraces into the mountainsides for practical farming. They were performing an act of devotion to the Apu, the mountain spirits they believed held their lives in balance. In Greece, a city might deliberately avoid building on a certain coastal headland, not because the soil was bad, but because it was considered sacred to Poseidon, the earth shaker. To violate that space was to invite a tremor that could shatter the entire community. This was more than superstition. It was a form of ancient urban planning and risk management, directly guided by the logic of myth. These shared beliefs forged a powerful collective identity, binding people together with a common purpose. When a disaster struck, it was never an individual's problem. It was a collective responsibility. The entire community would mobilize for rituals, from the grand sacrifices in a Greek temple to the daily offerings a farmer buried for Pachamama. This required a massive allocation of resources, time, and energy, all directed toward a single goal, appeasing the forces that could end their world. This system naturally created and reinforced a social hierarchy. A priestly class emerged as the essential intermediaries, the only ones believed capable of correctly reading the divine signs and performing the complex ceremonies needed for protection. Their authority was immense, as they could interpret a drought as a sign of the king's failing virtue or a plague as the result of a broken taboo. This centralized power and reinforced social order, but it also placed a heavy burden on leaders. A king who presided over a series of calamities could be seen as having lost the mandate of heaven, his right to rule dissolving with the failing harvests. The myths themselves became the foundation of ethical codes. To live a good life was to live in a way that pleased the gods and kept the earth stable. Avoiding disaster meant adhering to cultural norms, telling the truth, and respecting your neighbors. Morality was not an abstract concept. It was a practical necessity for survival, directly embedded in the community's environmental awareness. This ancient pattern of using a compelling narrative to guide public behavior during a crisis feels strikingly familiar. Today, we see institutions craft messages around public health or climate action, framing collective effort as a moral imperative for the greater good. The stories we tell to make sense of chaos, it seems, have always been the invisible architecture holding our societies together. The ground beneath our feet holds a library of forgotten stories. At the ancient Minoan settlement of Akrotiri on Santorini, archaeologists have peeled back layers of time to find a city frozen in a single, catastrophic moment, preserved under meters of volcanic ash. This was not a slow burial, but a sudden, dramatic end that correlates powerfully with later Greek legends of a magnificent island civilization vanishing beneath the waves, a story many believe inspired the myth of Atlantis. The ash itself tells a geological story, but the way the site was found, with no signs of panic or human remains, suggests the inhabitants had enough warning to flee. This hints at a deeper truth, that the memory of this real event was so traumatic it was woven into a mythic narrative of divine punishment, a story powerful enough to be retold for centuries. Across the ocean, the precise alignment of Mesoamerican temples with celestial bodies like Venus was not just advanced astronomy, it was a form of cosmic diplomacy. These structures were built to track the movements of gods, to predict their moods, and to perform rituals that would maintain the balance of the world. An inscription describing a planetary alignment that preceded a great drought was not a simple weather record. It was a divine warning heeded by priests and kings. The myth of a displeased rain god provided the framework for understanding the event, and the temple alignment was the technology used to anticipate it. We can now read these stone calendars and see the scientific observation, but for the people who built them, it was all part of a single, sacred conversation with the forces of creation. The material remains of this belief are everywhere. In earthquake-prone regions of the ancient world, archaeologists frequently uncover caches of votive offerings, small statues or precious objects deliberately buried in foundations or at sacred sites. These were not random acts of devotion. They were a community's investment in its own safety, a tangible effort to appease a deity like Poseidon and prevent the ground from shaking. The value of these offerings, sometimes comprising great wealth, reveals just how high the stakes were perceived to be. This was a society's budget for spiritual protection, a direct material consequence of their mythic worldview. Even the way these events were recorded shows the inseparable blend of history and belief. Mayan stelae, those great stone pillars carved with intricate hieroglyphs, often document real periods of drought and hardship. Yet the explanation given is never solely ecological. The text describes the suffering as a consequence of a broken covenant with the gods, of royal rituals left unperformed. The historical event and its mythological interpretation are one and the same, recorded for posterity to warn future generations. These physical traces allow us to reconstruct more than a timeline of disasters. They let us glimpse the human mind grappling with the unthinkable. We can see the profound need to find a reason, to assign responsibility, and to develop a ritualized response that restored a sense of control. The convergence of modern science and ancient myth does not discredit the old stories. Instead, it enriches our understanding. Geology can tell us when the volcano erupted, but the myth tells us how the survivors carried the memory. Astronomy can calculate the celestial alignment, but the temple inscription reveals the terror and awe it inspired. Together, they tell the complete story of human resilience, a tale not just of surviving the event, but of building meaning from its ashes. These physical remnants of faith point toward an even deeper layer of understanding, where the stories themselves become a symbolic language for the human psyche. A king's injustice could make the very earth tremble. Beyond their literal explanations, ancient disaster myths operated on a powerful symbolic level, where the collapse of the physical world mirrored the breakdown of moral and social order. An earthquake was not just the shaking of the ground, it was the shaking of a kingdom's foundations, a physical manifestation of a leader's failing authority. A great flood was rarely just water, it was a divine broom sweeping away a society grown corrupt, cleansing the moral decay that had festered in the hearts of the people. The storm that raged in the heavens perfectly mirrored the emotional chaos and unresolved conflicts within a community. These stories consistently linked the turmoil of the outer world with the turmoil within, providing a powerful, metaphorical language for concepts that were otherwise difficult to articulate. The psychologist Carl Jung saw these recurring symbols not as coincidences, but as archetypes rising from what he called the collective unconscious. These are universal patterns of thought and imagery shared across humanity, a deep well of primal fears and desires that find their most vivid expression in the forces of nature. A dragon is not merely a monster, it is the archetype of chaotic, untamed power. A great deluge is the archetype of both annihilation and purification. By projecting these internal struggles onto the grand canvas of a hurricane or a volcanic eruption, individuals could process their own personal crises, their own grief and anger through a cosmic narrative. This gave private pain a public, mythic scale, making it easier to understand and endure. The metaphors provided a shared vocabulary for abstract ideals. What does justice look like? It looks like a lightning bolt from a clear sky striking down the wicked. What does renewal feel like? It feels like the first green shoots emerging from the mud after a flood has receded. Concepts of balance, truth, and consequence were made tangible and immediate through the visceral experience of a disaster story. This symbolic richness allowed the myths to remain relevant long after their literal interpretations faded. A story about Poseidon's wrath could be understood by a Greek farmer as the cause of an earthquake, but also by a leader as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride. The same narrative could comfort a grieving person by framing their loss as part of a larger, necessary cycle of destruction and rebirth. This multifaceted role is something we see echoed in our own time. Modern films and literature often use the imagery of pandemics, asteroid impacts, or climate disasters not just as plot devices, but as powerful metaphors for societal breakdown, existential dread, or the urgent need for change. We still turn to disaster to talk about the things that shake us to our core, using the language of a world in upheaval to describe the storms we weather within. Two distant cultures could invent the same monster without ever meeting. The Great Flood, the earth-shaking serpent, the cosmic battle between order and chaos. These are not isolated ideas but a shared vocabulary of human fear and hope. When a myth about a world-ending deluge surfaces in the lore of over 200 separate cultures, from the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to the indigenous stories of the Americas, we are witnessing something more than coincidence. We are seeing the contours of a universal human psychology. The scholar David Leeming suggests that these recurring themes point to a collective subconscious, a deep well of archetypal images that spring forth whenever a community confronts its own fragility. The dragon that causes earthquakes in Chinese mythology and the serpent Apophis who shakes the earth in Egyptian belief are siblings of the same symbolic mind. They give form to our innate terror of the ground becoming unstable, of the very foundation of life betraying us. This global pattern reveals that our most profound questions are the same. How do we explain suffering? How do we maintain moral order in a world that seems random and cruel? The answer, woven into these shared stories, is that we transform chaos into a narrative. We create a world where disaster has a reason, where suffering has a purpose, and where survival is a testament to virtue. This symbolic reservoir offers a powerful lens on our shared humanity. It shows us that a farmer in ancient India and a sailor in ancient Greece both looked at a raging storm and saw not just wind and water, but a message about their place in the cosmos. They both crafted stories that linked their community's behavior to the stability of the world itself. This common project of meaning-making transcends time and geography, binding us together in a fundamental way. The diversity of the stories, the unique local spirits and specific rituals only enriches this underlying unity. Recognizing these threads does not diminish cultural uniqueness, but rather highlights a beautiful paradox. Our differences in expression celebrate a shared need to find light in the deepest dark, to build a raft of story that carries us through the flood. Our legal documents still speak of acts of God, a direct linguistic echo of when disasters were framed as divine verdicts. This term, found in insurance policies and legal codes, reveals how deeply embedded these ancient perspectives remain in our modern systems. We may understand plate tectonics, but our language preserves the old idea of a nature with intention. This mythic thinking extends into our blockbuster films, where disaster movies rarely present a crisis as a simple accident. A tidal wave or an asteroid impact becomes a moral reckoning, a force that exposes human folly and demands societal change. The narrative structure is strikingly familiar, a modern retelling of the flood myth where the catastrophe cleanses a corrupted world and the survivors learn a profound lesson. Our entertainment reflects our enduring need to find moral purpose in chaos, a need first articulated by civilizations who saw the gods in the storm. Environmental movements have powerfully adopted this ancient tool of personification. The phrase "Mother Earth is fighting back" is not a scientific statement, but a strategic, mythic one. It taps into that same deep-seated psychological impulse to see the natural world as a responsive, sentient force. By framing climate change as the planet's retaliation for human disrespect, activists blend the intuitive power of ancient narrative with the hard data of modern science. This fusion creates a more compelling and emotionally resonant call to action than statistics alone could ever achieve. Psychological research confirms this is not a coincidence. Studies of human behavior during crises show that when faced with overwhelming, inexplicable events, people consistently gravitate toward narrative explanations. Our brains, even now, seek to transform random tragedy into a story with a cause and an effect. This is the same cognitive process that led a farmer to blame a drought on an angry sky god. The mechanism is identical, only the context has changed. We are still using the same mental tools to build rafts of meaning in a sea of uncertainty. This enduring power of mythic thinking challenges the assumption that we have fully outgrown our ancient past. The line between the oracle reading animal entrails and the modern analyst reading climate models is thinner than we might care to admit. Both are attempts to predict an uncertain future and impose a framework of understanding upon a complex world. Consider for a moment how you personally interpret a string of unusually severe storms or a sudden earthquake. Even with a scientific explanation at your fingertips, a small, instinctual part of your mind might still search for a deeper reason, a pattern, or a message. That fleeting thought is the ghost of 1,000 ancient myths, whispering that the world is alive and speaking. This legacy does not ask us to abandon reason, but to recognize the profound role of story and symbol in how we navigate existence. The true challenge of our time may be to integrate our hard-won scientific knowledge with this timeless, intuitive understanding, forging a new wisdom for the challenges ahead. These ancient stories were not just explanations, they were ethical training in narrative form. The Mesopotamian flood myth served as a stark warning against human arrogance, making it clear that the clamor of an overreaching civilization could provoke a divine reset. For the Inca, every offering to Pachamama was a lesson in reciprocity, teaching that taking from the earth required giving back in a continuous cycle of respect. This narrative framework consistently linked human behavior to environmental stability, framing disaster as the direct consequence of a broken social or spiritual contract. A king's greed could lead to drought. A community's selfishness might summon a hurricane. By embedding these cause and effect relationships into their most sacred stories, these cultures cultivated a powerful sense of collective accountability. The myths encouraged prosocial behaviors not through abstract laws, but through visceral, unforgettable tales where the stakes were the survival of everyone. This ancient wisdom resonates with uncanny force today. In an era defined by climate change, we are grappling with the same fundamental questions these myths sought to answer. How does our collective conduct influence the health of our world? The stories of the past suggest that sustainable living is not a modern innovation, but a forgotten principle woven into humanity's oldest survival guides. They invite us to reflect on our own responsibilities, not to capricious gods, but to each other and the planetary systems that support all life. Revisiting these narratives can profoundly inform modern debates about resource distribution and intergenerational equity. They remind us that the concept of environmental justice is ancient, rooted in the understanding that no one is safe until everyone upholds their part of the bargain with the natural world. The moral compass within these disaster myths points toward a path of humility, community, and stewardship, offering a narrative foundation from which to rebuild a more balanced relationship with our planet. The climate crisis presents a familiar kind of chaos, one that our ancestors would have recognized instantly. While we have the science to explain rising seas and intensifying storms, we are grappling with the same profound need for a story that can hold our fear and guide our response. The ancient myths teach us that technical solutions, however vital, are only half the answer. A seawall can be overtopped, but a shared narrative of resilience can rebuild a community from the inside out. These old stories show us that recovery is not just about restoring infrastructure, it is about restoring meaning. After a hurricane scours a coastline or a wildfire consumes a town, the most enduring damage is often to the human spirit. The rituals that ancient peoples performed, from offerings to mountain spirits to chants for the thunder god, were not attempts to control the uncontrollable. They were acts of collective meaning-making that transformed passive terror into active, communal purpose. They provided a psychological scaffold for rebuilding, reinforcing the social bonds that disaster threatens to shatter. Our modern challenge is to forge narratives that are equally powerful, stories that can integrate the hard truths of climate science with a moral imperative for action. We need tales that do not simply warn of apocalypse, but that frame this moment as a necessary turning point, an opportunity for global renewal. What would a modern myth for sustainability look like? It might personify the planet not as a vengeful mother, but as a patient teacher showing us the consequences of imbalance. It could celebrate the heroes of innovation and community care, weaving their actions into an epic of collective survival. The wisdom of the past does not offer a literal blueprint, but a profound insight. Our capacity to endure an uncertain future may depend less on the technology we invent and more on the stories we choose to believe in, stories that can turn our collective anxiety into a covenant for a wiser world. Our journey through these ancient beliefs uncovers a universal human truth. We have always used stories to transform terror into meaning, finding a sense of agency when faced with the uncontrollable. These narratives were far more than simple explanations. They offered profound psychological comfort, giving communities a way to process their fear by turning a random earthquake into the action of a known deity. They built intricate social structures, uniting people under shared rituals and a common purpose that restored order after chaos. And they provided a clear ethical compass, linking the health of the community directly to the stability of the world itself. From Poseidon's earth-shattering trident to the Thunderbird storm-creating wings, these myths were humanity's first attempts to build a raft of understanding on a sea of uncertainty. These ancient explanations are not mere curiosities from a forgotten past. They are powerful reflections of our enduring quest to understand our place in a world of immense power. They remind us that our need for narrative is a fundamental part of being human, a tool we still use to navigate modern crises and personal challenges. The next time you witness a powerful storm or learn of a distant earthquake, consider the stories we tell about these events today. What new myths are we creating to explain the complexities of our time? How will the narratives we craft now shape the resilience of generations to come? I invite you to share your own thoughts on these powerful myths in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration into the mysteries of our past, subscribe for more journeys that help us see our world with both wonder